Marvel Legends exploded on the scene with an unmatched combination of comic-accurate sculpting and unrivaled articulation. But it was their next evolution that would change the toy industry forever. Hey y'all, welcome back to Carbon Scoring, the best place for comics history and action figures. We are now on to part 2 of our complete history of Marvel Legends, using all of the figures from my own personal collection. By the end of 2004, the Marvel Legends line was at a crossroads. They had already released over 50 unique characters over the previous 2 years, and the line was an undoubted success. But just how deep could they dig into the Marvel catalog of characters? You have to remember, this was long before the adult collector became a force in the toy market. These toys had to appeal to kids and their parents, otherwise they would clog up retail shelves. We were still years away from that first Iron Man movie, and the concept of an MCU was still just a twinkle in Kevin Feige's eye. Characters like Black Panther and Rocket Raccoon, now household names, had zero recognizability with the general public. If Marvel Legends wanted to sell figures of somebody other than Spider-Man and the Hulk, they needed a new plan. So Jesse Falcon, the father of Marvel Legends, came up with one of the most creative ideas in the history of the toy industry. He decided to pack in with each figure an additional part that allowed you to build another figure. So in order to complete this additional figure, you had to buy all the figures in a given wave, even if it was someone you had never heard of. This concept of the Build-A-Figure gave fans and collectors giant-sized characters that they would have otherwise never gotten. And it kept retailers happy, as their pegs weren't jammed up with unwanted Scarlet Witch figures. Open pegs meant new waves. New waves created more fans. And Falcon had started a revolution. Build-A-Figures became the industry standard, from Mattel to McFarlane. So let's look at some of those original BAFs, many of which became some of the greatest action figures of all time. And with that first Build-A-Figure wave, Toy Biz showed us just how far they were willing to go in giving us access to the entire Marvel Universe. Professor Charles Xavier is a perfect example of why the Build-A-Figure concept is so brilliant. Now, no one would argue that Professor X isn't a vital part of any action figure display. You need him for your X-Men display. And it's a really, really good figure. You know, you've got a nicely molded and sculpted wheelchair. The figure itself looks really good. The head sculpt really captures that comic look of Professor X. But let's be serious. This is a bald man in a suit in a wheelchair. This is maybe one of the least action figures of all time. But by having him in this Build-A-Figure wave, you can guarantee that you can get characters like this, ones that are absolutely crucial to our collection, into our collection. So Professor X, here's to you. You are the greatest example of why the Build-A-Figure concept was so necessary. Bullseye was the main villain in this wave, and he certainly shares a ton of parts with other figures. He's on kind of that standard sort of mid-size base body with the crazy hips, but you do get a really unique evil head sculpt, and there was a variant where he actually is showing his teeth. Plus, this piece that kind of comes up over his shoulders does kind of bring together the entire Bullseye look. It was really good to see Daredevil's villains getting some love relatively early in the Marvel Legends line. I have always been a huge fan of this Doctor Strange figure because I feel like it perfectly bridges the artistic styles of the two main eras of Strange's classic look. You get a very Steve Ditko looking costume. The fact that Strange is on the thinner body really works as a Steve Ditko type of figure. You've got the great chest emblem, and in particular, those kind of Kirby Ditko dots that he has here on both of his gloves look really well. And plus, these are not reused Spider-Man figures. These are specific for Doctor Strange, but they get that twisty, bendy Ditko look. And when you get them bent, given Toy Biz's penchant for articulation, you get a very, very Ditko look. But the head really captures more of the 1970s look for the character, which I think actually is a far better look with kind of the swooped back hair, the high brow with the widow's peak, and the silver temples. On top of that, this cape, while it can be a little bit cumbersome because it's sort of a heavy, rubbery plastic, really does give us a great look and presents the overall look. The Eye of Agamotto is there. Marvel Legends were meant to give us definitive versions of the characters. And for me, this is about as best of a combination classic Doctor Strange as we're ever going to get. I'm not going to act like War Machine is my favorite character, but I have to give them credit for kind of, making chicken salad out of this thing. Yeah, he's still on that same original Iron Man base body, but there's so much new sculpting in all of these overlays with his Gatling gun here on top. There's detail throughout the gauntlets, the boots, all of that is completely new. And because we're talking about Toy Biz, you do get a fully sculpted, fully painted James Rhodes head underneath. Pretty nice. This figure also came with numerous like explosion accessories to really kind of bring out the war aspect of War Machine. So while it's never going to go down as my favorite character selection, they at least did give it full effort. The Build-A-Figure concept comes through again by helping us to get Deathlok in the line. Now, this 1970s Rich Buckler creation may not be very well known to people outside of the comics industry, but unlike Professor X, you can see how this guy would really show up on toy shelves. That great red metallic paint against the technical parts, his half zombie, half cyborg head. I mean, this guy really pops. I hate it that I don't have the tubing that goes along with his gun because that really kind of brings his whole mercenary look together. But when you talk about just straight up cool action figures, hard to beat Deathlock. There are very few figures that have stood the test of time and lasted decades on my shelf in my displays, but Nightcrawler is one of them. This thing is just absolutely special. Look at the bend that you get at the knee so that you can get him into such a great crouching Nightcrawler pose. The articulation at the neck allows him to really be looking forward. But let me just show you the levels that they went to with this one. Yes, you get individually articulated toes, and that includes the toe on the back. The little heel toe is articulated. Same thing here. The fingers are uniquely and individually articulated, and this tail, yep, that's a bendy wire. You can shape that thing into anything you want. Even our most recent Nightcrawler figures, which are gorgeous. I mean, he's such a clean, classic design. This is one of the classic Dave Cockrum designs from New X-Men. Even though those are great, I don't know that they have ever captured everything that you wanted out of a Nightcrawler the way that this one did. And there is truly nothing that I like better than an action figure that represents the specific style of one artist. And when that artist is Jack the King Kirby, the co founder of the Marvel Universe and the co creator of The Incredible Hulk, it's just that much sweeter. Look at that Kirby brow. Look at that upper lip and that tiny nose, the way that everything is just pinched, that incredible kind of bowl cut on top on a totally new base body with some really unique articulation, particularly at the diaphragm. This Hulk by itself would have made this wave, but they gave us a green variant, not just a repainted head, an entirely new head sculpt on our green Hulk. This is the one that looks like Hulk's appearances in those very first issues of the Avengers. So here's to the king, and here is to getting a perfect representation of his artwork in 6-inch form. But when you put them all together, that is when the greatest revolution in modern toy marketing began. The absolute perfect figure to start the Build-A-Figure waves with, none other than the Devourer of Worlds, Galactus. Now, I've talked a lot in going through these figures about how Marvel Legends are meant to represent kind of the most classic versions of the character. And Galactus has appeared numerous different ways in the comics. You know, you can go back to Jack Kirby's kind of original biker shorts version. But for me, as a comic reader in the 1980s, it was John Byrne's Galactus that I felt like really best represented the character, even moving forward. And this, while it certainly has, as Byrne certainly paid homage to those classic Kirby details, this, particularly this head sculpt, really brings out that John Byrne 1980s Galactus look. So it's just gorgeous and it's so great. It is still a figure that I have in my Fantastic Four display to this day. He's not as big as our HasLab Galactus, but he fits in really well with the figures we have. He has completely full articulation, double jointed elbows, double jointed knees, ball shoulders. This guy has the exact same articulation as all of our 6-inch legends, only it is the massive Galactus. Our next wave had a pretty strong X flavor to it, with a couple of notable exceptions. The first figure in this wave is one of the original X-Men, Warren Worthington's Angel. Now, he's not in his original X-Men guise. This is more of his 70s and 80s look, which he did wear while a part of the X-Men, but also while he was a member of the Defenders as well. It's on that same base body that we've seen Reed Richards and the Silver Surfer on. But hey, other than a really cool head sculpt, nobody's looking at this body. They're looking at these wings and the amount of sculpted detail and paint wash to bring out these beautiful feathered wings on the Angel. And just look at how huge they are. I mean, they are an absolute massive span. They're articulated so that you can get him into numerous looking flying poses. Angel predominantly wore the red costume throughout this time, but he would occasionally be seen in his blue and white garb, which is represented on this variant. And honestly, I've kind of always preferred the look of this one. I just think that blue and white is so clean, and the way that they got some paint wash to bring out the details of the sculpt just looks great. But again, these wings are absolutely epic. The first of our villains in this wave was an actual newcomer to the Marvel Universe, having just appeared in the early 90s in the pages of Jim Lee's X-Men book, and it's Omega Red. Look at all the just little details on Omega Red. This incredibly nasty head sculpt with like the chain kind of coming back off of his teeth, that gritted expression. I always loved the dynamic expression of Toy Biz Marvel Legends. And he came with these bendy wire attachments to kind of replicate the stuff that you saw in the pages of Jim Lee's X-Men comic. Not quite as shiny red here, but you did get some of the metallic on his gauntlets and down here on this boots. Just a great representation of the 90s, totally flying out, ponytail and all. The devil really is in the details with this Mr. Sinister figure. So Sinister first appeared, I believe, in the pages of X Factor, but really came to prominence during the Fall of the Mutants storyline, which was drawn a lot by Mark Silvestri. And you can see kind of those really carved out Silvestri lines. But look at how the fading on the paint detail, the fact that these tendrils are kind of blue on this side, but red on the other side really brings out a tremendous amount of detail. This great collar coming up over the top, and he's on a bigger buck, so he really does look like a dominant figure. Mr. Sinister, this one was still in my X-Men villains display even up to just a few weeks ago, and a lot of it is because of just how well executed this figure truly is. Another original X-Man, but one that wasn't shown quite as much love, is Cyclops. So this was the only kind of classic 70s, 80s Cyclops that we had for a long time. And it's a serviceable figure. I think they reused some of the WWE torso for this one because you don't get the typical ab crunch or diaphragm joint there that most Marvel Legends had. These boots clearly came from another figure, but you did get a really stoic, well done, well sculpted head for Scott Summers. Thankfully, we've gotten a recent update of this figure, but for a long time, this kind of muddy version of Psyche was the only classic one that we had. Toy Biz still hadn't figured out the ladies, and that was readily apparent with this Mystique figure. Now, because of her costume, because of her blue skin and the white part coming there under her neck, it does help to hide some of those really terrible articulation points, but the flimsy body, the really weak wrist, the just kind of nonsensical body shape still exist. They added some really good details like the skulls along her belt, and I do like her unique haircut here, but overall, this is just another example of Toy Business Sculptors just not quite there with the female figures yet. Eagle eyed viewers picked up on the fact that I talked about the legendary Riders wave before I began talking about these Build a Figure waves, and that was actually out of order. But because that wave came out after this one, but did not include a Build a Figure, I went ahead and talked about it early. The reason why that's important is because the Wonder Man in that line actually shares the exact same torso as this incredible Black Panther. And it really works for Panther. You can see all of that detailing, all of that just kind of sharp little bit of almost like greebling. It really, really brings that Panther, that cat-like style. And this figure is based on a very specific comic run on Black Panther drawn by Mark Teixeira. And the sculptors here managed to perfectly capture the Panther's look from that exact comic series. So it works for Panther. It really didn't work for Wonder Man, but it gave us an incredibly special figure in this wave. And finally, we get the first appearance of the Amazing Spider-Man in the Marvel Legends proper line. And oh, this thing is just so close to being perfect. This is the Amazing Fantasy 15 Spider-Man, and it's a completely new sculpt, I believe. It's a very, very thin, very teenage-looking Spider-Man, thin legs, thin arms, very reminiscent of Steve Ditko's artwork in Amazing Fantasy 15 and in those early issues of Amazing Spider-Man. But if you remember, the cover for Amazing Spider-Man was actually drawn by Jack Kirby, and so this figure much more represents the look of Kirby's art. The style of the eyes is a complete, perfect replication of what was going on in Amazing Fantasy 15. The spider logo on the chest, and specifically the spider logo on the back with that little head, are exactly what we saw in that first appearance issue. Now, the only difference is in that first issue, there was a color misprint and it was actually blue instead of red. The figure actually came with like a web cape to try to replicate his underarm webs. It looked terrible. It never worked. And so I've actually removed it from all the different copies of this I have. You get all of the incredible articulation, including individually articulated figures. Oh, it's so close. It still really captures the cover of AF-15, and it's a great chance to actually get Spidey into Marvel Legends proper.
But a wave dominated by mutants deserved a mutant dominating killing machine as its Build-A-Figure.
It was not a coincidence that the first two HasLabs that Hasbro put out were the Sentinel and Galactus, mirroring the first two Build-A-Figures that we got from Toy Biz. And here is the Sentinel, our second Build-A-Figure. Now, unlike when we talked about Galactus, which represented a really, really classic 1980s look for the character, this is not a classic looking Sentinel. This actually comes from a very specific comic run from the 2000s. This is the end of Grant Morrison's time on New X-Men and a storyline called Welcome to Tomorrow. And it's actually based off of the artwork of artist supreme Mark Silvestri. And they captured it so well. All the little tech bits, all of this, veining and pipes and wires and everything, even down to the repulsor blast and the very specific look of this Sentinel's head. I owned 3 of these. They have been the backbone and foundation and backdrop of my X-Men villains display for decades now, because this metallic sheen, just this kind of dirty, crazy future robot, mutant killing hunter machine, is just absolutely gorgeous.
If you're loving this figure-by-figure documentary of every Marvel Legends figure ever, tell me about it in the comments. Give the video a like and share it with your friends. And subscribe to Carbon Scoring, because we're bringing you quality content like this every week. 70s Kung Fu icons, 80s Canadian superheroes, and modern versions of all-time classics, this wave had it all.
This wave felt like the wave of a zillion variants, but let's start out with one of my favorite basic figures, and one that truly did stand the test of time and remained on display in my collection for years and years, and that is the Immortal Iron Fist. Ooh, this just gets all of that 70s kung fu goodness. This is one where the Toy Biz articulated fingers actually really work because you get kind of like the karate chop hand, and you've got sort of the combo fist hand, so that you can also put like his chi effect, so you can get like the actual iron fist. But it's the combination of the open vest with the dragon tattoo and this great collar that comes up, and he's got his kind of bandana mask and those excellent eyes. Oh, the yellow and green just pop. He's got the little sandals, kind of the little footies on there. So great. And that stoic look, I think really works for Iron Fist, particularly when we got the red kind of rage variant. And obviously, it's basically the same figure, only recolored red, but there is a completely new head sculpt with kind of the screaming head and his hair sticking out. So, this was not a variant that I was able to find back in the day. I got this much later off of eBay, but a really sweet version of Iron Fist, and the two of them together just look fantastic. There are two things for me that make a great action figure: detail and accuracy. And when we're talking about Sasquatch, the detail is pretty obvious. Every single hair is individually sculpted all the way down. All of the extra hairs, even the grime on his toes, is sculpted in. And this flowing hair coming off his back with the shadowing work, oh, it's just absolutely amazing. But it's the accuracy that really makes this figure stand out. So, Alpha Flight first appeared in X-Men comics during the Chris Claremont, John Byrne run. And they were such popular kind of side characters that Marvel said they wanted them to have their own book. They wanted, to expand more into the Canadian market. They wanted to create this team of Canadian superheroes. And they asked John Byrne to do it. And he was like, I'm not really interested in that. But then he realized, no, these were my creations. And if I don't do them, somebody's going to do them wrong. And so he did. So he drew, I want to say, like the first 19 or 20 some odd, wrote and drew the first 20 issues of Alpha Flight. And this Sasquatch looks exactly like his work on the title. That is a very John Byrne face. The body style, the body shape is absolutely perfect. And that's why this is still the Sasquatch that I use in my Alpha Flight display to this very day. Now, there was a white albino variant of this that was supposed to represent Snowbird taking on Sasquatch's form. Unfortunately, I don't have that one, but it's kind of hard to go wrong when you get this incredible Sasquatch. Oh boy, but not every figure is a winner, and Toy Biz continues their perfect record on female figures with this Laura X figure. Ugh. Ugh. That face is so bad, so flat. We've gotten so many terrific paint apps, and then we get this on this terrible, goofy body that they've kind of shrunk down to sort of make her look like a teenager. Now, the one thing I will say, the one thing that they did well was she has her two claws up top, and then she actually has retractable claws at her feet. That is the only redeeming quality of this figure. And if you want to make it worse, her variant actually looks even more terrible. I'm not exactly sure what the thought process was on this, but this is two pretty bad figures back to back. But come on, man, Marvel Legends aren't going out like that. Not when they produce one of the greatest Wolverine figures ever, the Astonishing X-Men figure based off of the epic comic by writer Joss Whedon and artist John Cassidy. And this thing is full on Cassidy, down to the stitching on the costume, the stitching around the mask, that look, that head is straight out of a page of John Cassidy's artwork. Plus, this Wolvie is small. He really is kind of the right height and the right proportions. This thing looks so good. And yeah, it's a little outdated. These ball hips, kind of the claws being so bendy. There's things that, have obviously been improved upon, but there's something about the sculpting of that mask that just screams John Cassidy's artwork. And for me, that's why this has always been a favorite. It did have an unmasked variant, which unfortunately I don't believe I have, but that's okay, because this is the one that I would always put out in my display. Some figures just feel like they get extra attention, and that seems to be the case with this epic Bishop figure. Look at how gorgeous that yellow and blue, but then it's the metallic red highlights that pop. Classic Jim Lee stylings. He comes with not one that fits into a holster, but two epic weapons. So cool. And of course, because it's the 90s, you've got that incredible soul glow hair going on. Now, he did have a bald variant, but for my money, this is 90s. This is classic Bishop. This is the one that I want. Maestro is like the evil future version of the Hulk who has kind of taken over the Marvel universe and is ruling over all. You can tell he's old because he's got like all these like liver spots and warts all over him. It's a good sculpt. I think it utilizes some pieces from previous Hulks kind of cobbled together. I do like that he has his kind of, balding head with this crown with these gorgeous, tusks coming off of it. But I would be remiss if I didn't point out the really bizarre articulation. Look at these latissimus muscles, how they kind of come out almost like miniature udders underneath his arm. Toy Biz was never afraid to kind of push the envelope, but this is one that maybe they got the wrong address.
Claiming to be the Earth's first mutant, Apocalypse stands tall over this wave.
Oh, Apocalypse makes so much sense as a Build-A-Figure. He is huge. I think he's actually taller than both Galactus and the Sentinel. And for a character who can manipulate and control his entire molecules and can shapeshift, it certainly makes complete sense that he would be this giant, massive figure. Now, you can hear he has some ratcheting joints here at his middle. That helps him to stay stable, but he's pretty wobbly after all these years with these giant ball hips. But the inclusion of the tentacles, the tendrils coming around, and this unbelievably massive head sculpt that just gets that Walt Simonson artwork from the early days when Apocalypse was first appearing in X Factor. Oh, it's so good. This is a villain worthy of the X-Men.
Toy Biz made a bold move with an all-villain lineup titled Bring on the Bad Guys.
Can you imagine a mass market line of action figures being released these days with a wave of all villain figures, particularly with mainly obscure villains to boot? That's almost as hard to believe as the fact that this Abomination figure was released as a single carded, regularly priced action figure. Yeah, this huge hunk of plastic with a comic, with a base, all came for $8. And the amount of attention to detail and the different paint washes to bring out this incredible sculpting is just mammoth. Oh, this is still, I think, the best comic Abomination. And look at all the little spikes on his head. This thing is so good. We've talked repeatedly about Toy Biz's struggles with female action figures. So what do they decide to do? Somehow make it worse. The proportions on this Lady Deathstrike are just comical. I mean, these crazy long mechanical arms, these scrawny little legs, and her neck jutted completely out. I mean, just completely out. I suppose it's to allow for this head sculpt. Oh man, thank goodness we finally got a redo on this because this thing is just straight up crazy. Ah, yes, Marvel Legends, the action figure line where we get definitive versions of the greatest characters in their classic costumes. Unless it's Loki, where we get this whatever this thing is. I'm sure it represents some specific moment in the comics, but it is so specific. This head sculpt so just stylized and detailed that it doesn't fit in with any of our other legends. It's such an odd inclusion to have decided to go with this version of one of the most classic characters in the Marvel Universe. Now, it just so happens I was looking to see if I had the variant of this figure, and I don't. But I do have one for some reason still originally in package. So it's a great chance to look at that classic Marvel Legends clamshell packaging that you had to, have some kind of scissors to get into. There's, wire in there holding him in place. There's our Build-A-Figure part. You can see the comic in the back and a great clear bubble to allow you to see the figure. Love the cross sell with the Build-A-Figure right there in the middle. Even has like info on the character itself. Such a great thing. So kind of bad luck that I didn't have the Crown of Thorns or Crown, the whatever the Crown variant was, but I'm glad we actually got to see an original Marvel Legends packaging. I thought this Pyro figure was so good back in the day. That red and yellow, the piping coming around, the specifically sculpted fingers so that he could like shoot his fire blast, that manic, evil looking head sculpt, the thin framed body. I mean, really, honestly, for the time, this was a terrific figure. Now, we have subsequently gotten a far, far better version, and this one has been put to pasture. But there's still days where I look back at this and think, man, that's actually a really good action figure. Blackheart. Super, super obscure villain. As a matter of fact, I still don't believe I own a comic book in which this character appears. I think he's like a Ghost Rider villain. I want to say that he was designed and co-created by John Romita Jr. And I can kind of see that John Romita Jr. art style and this crazy, hair and tendrils. Again, a really, really large figure for a regular release. In fact, the next time that we saw this guy in the Marvel Legends line, he was the Build-A-Figure. So that gives you an idea of the bang for your buck that you were getting from those early Toy Biz Marvel Legends. And now the definitive Green Goblin figure, period, end of story. I can't tell you how many goblins we have gotten since this one, and none of them have come close to matching the perfection that this figure is. Yeah, he's maybe a little bit small by today's standards, but that head so perfectly captures the artwork of John Romita Sr. from his early days on Amazing Spider-Man issues like 39, 40, 41, when the Green Goblin finds out Peter's identity and reveals his own. He's got his satchel with even the button colored in, even the stitching on the satchel, all the detail of the Goblin's costume is in there, and this perfect classic Goblin glider that he fits on so, so well. This is it, man. This is the definitive Goblin figure. It is still right at the front and center of my Spider-Man villains display.
A villainous wave deserves a villainous Build-A-Figure. How about one that shook up the entire Marvel Universe?
Oh boy, Onslaught here has some pretty wackadoo comic backstory. So it's supposed to be kind of the worst aspects of both Professor Xavier and Magneto all put together into one evil sentient being. What it actually looks like is a giant Magneto crab. This character kind of represents much of everything that was wrong with comics in the 1990s and is responsible for one of what I consider the darkest times in the history of the Marvel Comics universe. After the speculator boom of the 1990s, things were bad. Marvel was headed towards bankruptcy, and they were going to do just about anything to stay solvent. And that included basically handing over the Fantastic Four to Jim Lee and the Avengers to Rob Liefeld and kind of giving them full creative control of two of the cornerstones of the Marvel Universe. And in order to manage that, they utilized the Onslaught storyline to kill the FF and the Avengers and then separate them and put them into a pocket universe. It was just as ham fisted as that explanation makes it sound. Now, I got to give them credit. They tried really hard on Magneto Evil Crab here, but I just can't get over the backstory of this guy.
I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when they came up with this ridiculously diverse lineup of characters for the Mojo wave.
There are some characters that are just doomed to be crapped on. And then there's Falcon. Going back in history, if you look at the Falcon's very first action figure, his Mego figure from the 1970s, the company was so cheap that they didn't want to print new plastic in this darker skin tone. And so they simply reused Planet of the Apes monkey hands for Falcon's hands. That is so amazingly disrespectful. And that tradition continued with Toy Business Falcon figure. Look, it's red plastic. The dark skin is actually painted over the top of red plastic. And it's really obvious when you get into some of the nooks and crannies of it. Even the head is actually white with the dark skin painted over the top. Now, this figure does have some really nice touches. I like the electronics in the wings. I like the detail on his boots. And the fact that this is still the only classic 70s vested Falcon that we've gotten is really unconscionable. I mean, that's just one more knock on Falcon as an action figure hero. He just has always gotten the short end of the stick. Now, this figure did get a variant version, and we see here the more modern Falcon. Now, this version has been remade in the modern Marvel Legends line, but that's not enough. We need a classic Falcon to make up for all of this nonsense. On the other hand, I respect a toy company that shows its respect to the fans. And if you gave us the Iron Fist in the last wave, you gotta give us this classic 70s Luke Cage in this one. And baby, this bad boy is just oozing with attitude. Look at those sideburns. Look at that haircut. Look at his like tiara. I love the chain belt. This is 70s bad man Luke Cage. I still think that the attitude of this figure has not been matched. I thought that the newer Luke Cage just didn't have nearly the amount of personality that this one did. Those two, Danny and Luke, look so good together. Now, let's not start acting like Toy Biz had finally figured out how to make female action figures. But this Psylocke is definitely a move in the right direction, and it is all based on one thing. They got rid of that stupid neck joint. So you give up most of the articulation of her head, but it still just looks so much better not having that gaping hinge right there at the neck. It's a decent head sculpt for Betsy here, and I kind of like this figure. It's really actually not bad. Arguably, this is the best female figure that we've seen so far. We've mentioned earlier that artist extraordinaire Art Adams was part of the design team for Marvel Legends. And thankfully, we got his original creation, his kind of breakthrough into comics long shot in action figure form. And this hair, this oh so 80s, it could only work in comics hair, really captures exactly what Art Adams was drawing. They got the little details right, the bandolier strap, his satchel. They got all the details on the costume, but most importantly, they got the fact that Longshot only has 4 fingers, so it's correct on both hands. Really nice touch. It's been a while since we'd had a good old fashioned Nazi in the line, and Baron Zemo here certainly fits the bill. I mean, how evil do you look with that hood on? Plus, it's obviously cold where he's coming from because he's got like his parka sort of jacket going here. But this is one where the variant figure truly takes the cake because we got an unmasked Zemo head, and that is absolute horror in plastic. Oh my gosh, look at like the melted lips across his mouth, the scars going across his head, the actual, like, you can see his skull coming through the flesh. This is truly one of the most grotesque sculpts that you would see on regular toy shelves ever. The eternal debate when looking at Toy Biz Marvel Legends figures is which ones have stood the test of time, which ones still stand with the greatest Marvel Legends that are being created by Hasbro now. And for me, perhaps at the very top of that list is first appearance Iron Man. There is something so perfect about the clunkiness of this figure. Even those silly Toy Biz ball joints, even the ones at the hips, really work to really bring this entire package together. You've got the little plug-in outputs, you've got his little antenna, and of course, there's a sculpted Tony Stark head right inside. This thing is just ideal. I just love how great it looks. And as a bonus, we got the gold version as well as a variant, and it is just as good. So if you're looking for somebody to fill out your original Avengers roster, look no further than that Toy Biz first appearance Iron Man figure.
I hope you haven't eaten recently, because it's time to look at the Mojo Build-A-Figure.
We just talked about comic artist Art Adams working with the Marvel Legends team, and this line including his singular creation, Longshot. But who was the bad guy from that Longshot miniseries? None other than Mojo. And this thing is just absolutely stunning. Look at the painted detail. Look at all of the different paint apps going into the head of Mojo. This grotesque globular body with all of the rubs and paint and the detailing, even on the back of his chair, has unbelievably intricate detailing going all the way around. His throne has little Mojo relief sculptures sculpted into it, and all of these arms are articulated. This is a smaller Build-A-Figure than the ones that we had seen, but what they included was the amount of detail that had never, ever been shown before in the Marvel Legends line. This thing is still a total work of art.
Toy Biz's chinks in the armor are starting to show a little bit as we come to the penultimate Build-A-Figure wave.
This was a wave where you felt like you could maybe start to see some of the wheels coming off of Toy Biz's Marvel Legends line. Let's take this Beta Ray Bill, for example. This is an absolutely perfect sculpt, getting all of the correct details of Walt Simonson's original artwork for Beta Ray Bill from his first appearances in the books of Thor. You've got a great Stormbreaker. You've got some decent wash down here, but there's a real lack of paint wash on the head and on the arms, and it makes this figure way, way too bland for what it should be. There's no wash up here on the wings of his helmet. This is what we began to see later on when Hasbro took over the line, but some of those origins and cutting corners began in this wave. The Kree warrior Captain Marvel is a great use of that mid-size body, and I was always a big fan of the way his hair came swooping out of his costume, which was really well done here. The addition of his omnibands to this sculpt really adds just a little bit of flair to the character, but it's the variant that things really get good with the Genisvel version, because here we actually have translucent plastic for the star pieces. So these legs, the hands, the neck and head are actually sculpted out of translucent plastic with paint over the top. It gives a really, really cool star effect, and it's an actually super sweet looking figure. Moon Knight has one of the most striking designs in comics. Yeah, some people say he's just sort of a Batman clone, but they're really missing out on a lot of the beauty of Bill Sienkiewicz's design of this character, particularly the use of crescents. You know, the crescent moon is Moon Knight's main symbol, and he replicated that with the crescent cape and the crescent dip in the hood, and this figure perfectly captures that. I love the two-tone look of this cape and the fact that when you have him standing upright, it swoops down around just exactly the way a Sienkiewicz drawing would. There were two versions of this, the silver and the black, both of them with the really cool cape. As a matter of fact, that cape is so cool, I took one of my old Moon Knight figures and put it on the new one. Another example of this just doesn't quite hold up to the paint standard that we've been used to is the Thor Buster Iron Man armor. Again, it really stands out that there's just not the kind of wash on this figure that we've seen with the rest of Marvel Legends. Now, there's a ton of new sculpting here, which does make a quite unique figure, and thankfully, they used this mold to give us a variant figure of the Destroyer. Now, the Destroyer actually has this incredibly intense, distressed, multi-layered paint scheme so that you get this armored look that has all of this to it. So it's kind of a shame that this very difficult to find variant was so much better than the mainline released figure. And then things really get bad. I am holding these two figures very gingerly because they're literally falling apart. I don't know what it is about the plastic or the particular makeup of both of our Spider Women here. You have the Jessica Drew Spider Woman and the Julia Carpenter Spider Woman, but they are fragile. Now, one thing they did get right was the underarm wings on Spider Woman. I don't know how they could do such a good job on this and never figure it out on Spider-Man, but somehow they did. These are identical figures. They have the exact same frame and proportions. They're just painted differently. So it's a great way to kind of fill out our character selections, but oh boy, these are pretty bad. Much better is Janet Van Dyne, the Wasp, a key member of any Avengers lineup. Really good to have Jan in the line. I love her wings. Even though they might have been better if they were translucent, they still have a lot of look, but they are lacking again in that paint wash. This version is from the more modern Kurt Busiek, George Perez run in the 2000s, a terrific comic run if you're looking to go back and reread your Avengers. But the Wasp was known for her costume changes. And so thankfully, she got a more 80s variant with kind of the W motif, a completely different head with different hairstyle, and again, the wings. And there was even an exceedingly rare blue variant that I'm not sure ever made it out of the prototype phase. That is one that no one has.
Okay, say it with me. Mobile organism designed only for killing. MODOK.
This stunningly amazing MODOK was the Build-A-Figure for this wave, and it includes such just subtle detail and a completely unsubtle facial sculpt. The teeth, the gnashing lips, the split eyes, the furrowed brow, the Kirby-looking design all around. He's on a base that rotates with like an exploding jet blast underneath, and he still has Marvel Legends level articulation. Yep, even those ankles bend. This thing is just so ridiculously awesome that I can't even begin to explain it all.
The final Build-A-Figure wave was an incredibly difficult to find Walmart exclusive. Oh, come on, man. I worked for like half an hour to try to get these things to stand up.
Thor appeared in one of the very first waves of Marvel Legends, but that figure was a bit of a hodgepodge. It was using some wrestling parts, and it had a very stylized facial sculpt. Finally, in the last Build-A-Figure wave, we got a much more comic accurate Thor. I still love this figure. I think it is still the best comic accurate Thor that we've ever gotten. Look at that sculpt of his head, his chin, Mjolnir, the bright colors. Everything that you could want in a Thor figure is right here in this one. Cyclops' his baby brother, Alex Summers, makes his Marvel Legends debut with this terrific figure of Havok. They really knew to use the flat hands to kind of really generate Havok's power blast that kind of emanated from this like bullseye on his chest. But what I really like is this head sculpt harkens back to that very, very brief run that Neil Adams had on the X-Men title when Havok and Polaris were part of the team. It just captures some of that 70s, 80s vibe so well. Actually, speaking of the great Neil Adams, his artwork during the classic Avengers run, the Kree-Skrull War, is captured perfectly with the mask on this Ant-Man figure. It just has that absolutely perfect 80s shape. The figure itself is nothing really to write home about. It's just sort of the standard male buck, but that helmet works so well. Not quite as good is the reuse of that Black Panther torso for Captain Britain. You can see all of the sculpted detail from the Panther costume that just doesn't work with Captain Britain. It completely conflicts with his mask. His mask is smooth, and yet we're left with this rough-hewn texture up here. This is one of the more disappointing figures in the line because Captain Britain has such an incredible look and style, and this just could have been so much better. Oh, but they weren't done because the exact same body was used for the Sentry. Look, there it is. There's that Black Panther torso. Now, granted, the shape of it looks pretty good. And, this classic kind of 1960s Sentry figure, I think actually works pretty well. But it doesn't make sense with this textured body frame. Now, the variant Sentry from like newer times where he has his beard and longer hair, the brighter colors tend to wash out a lot of that texture. You don't see it quite as well. But this was yet another miss in what could have been two epic action figures. Age of Apocalypse is one of the great X-Men mini stories. It's kind of an alternate reality timeline where everything is backwards and Apocalypse is sort of the ruler of all. But of course, Wolverine was right at the center point of that storyline, and the love triangle between Scott Summers, Wolverine, and Jean Grey led to Scott blowing Wolvie's arm off. Yep, that actually happened. But luckily, we get a second version where he still has his claws coming out of the stump. This scarred burned version of Wolverine. Again, kind of goes back to that Baron Zemo look. Just incredible sculpting here for an Age of Apocalypse Wolverine variant. Carol Danvers' Miss Marvel is another classic Avengers figure that we really need in our collection, but not this one. Even the addition of a new kind of joint at the shoulder isn't enough to save this thing from gangly, just terribleness. The hair looks so bad. The head is missized. The body is that frail body for like a super heroic, super powered figure. Ooh, we just never got there. And the same can be said for longtime crush of the channel, Shadowcat or Kitty Pryde. Here we've got Kitty in her astonishing X-Men outfit, but instead of looking like, a cute, sprightly young woman, she looks like an old maid with this head sculpt. Now, I do love the fact that we got her pet dragon Lockheed and that he could sit right on her arm. That's a cool feature, but nothing else about this looks like Kitty Pryde to me.
The final Toy Biz Build-A-Figure looks like it's going to end up being the final Marvel HasLab, none other than Giant Man.
My dad used to always tell me if they're gonna run you out of town, strut like you're leading the parade. And that is exactly what Toy Biz accomplished with their final Build-A-Figure of Giant Man. We talk a lot on this channel about the advances that Hasbro has made in inkjet technology and what it has done to really create some unbelievably realistic faces. Yeah, look at this 20 years earlier. That is the best facial paint that Toy Biz ever produced. It is so good. And because this guy's proportions work out much better, this is the Giant Man that's still on display on my Avengers shelf. It's got all of the articulation. It's basically a 2-up of one of the regular 6-inch figures. But again, the thing that really sets this one apart are the eyes, baby. That is one Hank Pym that you just cannot resist.
If you're enjoying this documentary-style look at the history of Marvel Legends, leave me a comment and let me know. Hopefully, we're just getting started. And as always, for the best in comics history and action figures, subscribe to Carbon Scoring.